All right, in this issue we're turning to questions of ethics, another complicated and fascinating set of issues. So I want to start with a straightforward question of ethics, which is this: what is the meaning of life? All right, maybe not so straightforward, but nonetheless, that's the question where the rubber meets the road for philosophy. Ultimately, we want our philosophical answers to have some sort of impact, be relevant to our lives. And when we think about questions of the meaning of our lives, we're asking ethics questions in a highly applied philosophical way. Now, questions of the meaning of the life have kind of a reputation for being abstract and unanswerable, and I don't think that is true. I think we all think about these issues and we all have an answer to the questions of the meaning of life. If you think, for example, of momentous occasions in our lives or the lives of those we care about, say the birth of a child. And as we gaze upon the child or hold the child and see the child doing its initial things with its life, we know it has a whole life ahead of us, and usually we have philosophical moments built into that kind of an experience. What will this child's life be like? What is possible to this child? What are our hopes and aspirations for the child? Or if we go to the other end of the life cycle, a death, and we attend a funeral and there are eulogies and we are reflecting on the person's life. What kind of a life he or she led? Was it a good one? Was it a meaningful one? Was it a significant life? And ordinarily we are led to think of our own lives in relationship. What can we learn positively or negatively from the example of the person who has now died, realizing that at some point we will be in that situation having died. By the time we reach that point, what will we want to have accomplished in our life? Now, so I think we all have an answer to the question of meaning of life, whether we have worked it out explicitly, consistently, abstractly, right, or not. Think of the standard phenomenon: we wake up in the morning and we get out of bed and we proceed about our daily business. Well, that's a philosophical set of activities already. Just getting out of bed in the morning presupposes that it's worth getting out of bed in the morning. If you don't think it's worth getting out of bed in the morning, perhaps you're severely depressed, then you've reached a conclusion, a felt conclusion that life is meaningless. But if, by contrast, that's not you, you do have goals that you want to achieve during the course of that day, you do have at least an implicit answer to the question of what the meaning of your life is and what you plan to accomplish that day as a step toward it. Now, where ethics questions come in more directly is if we think about, say, that moment of getting out of bed in the morning. At that point, your day is a blank slate. There are an indefinite number of things potentially one could do, millions and billions of possibilities. Out of all of those possibilities, we've selected or pre-selected a certain number of them. There are things I am going to do today, things I'm not going to do today, things that I hope to get done today, and we'll have a list, maybe a prioritized list, but even built into that then is a set of value standards, assumptions about ethics, and so forth. What gets onto your list are going to be things that are judged by you to be valuable. Things that don't get onto your list or never get onto your list, you never are going to put onto your list. Those are going to be things that you judge not to be valuable. And even among the things that do get onto your list, if you have a prioritized list, then you are making judgments about better or worse, more important or less important. And that presupposes some sort of standard for sorting between the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the worthwhile, the not worthwhile, the important, the less important, and the trivial or not important at all. And all of those questions, or standards rather, raise questions of ethics. What kind of a standard are we using when we're sorting things in the world and our lives into the good and the bad? And how do we go about doing this process better, in a more informed way, so that we can have an answer to the meaning of life and put it into practice strategically and tactically to achieve the best kind of life that is possible to us. All right, ethics is complicated. Part of the reason why the question of the meaning of life has its reputation for being an abstract and perhaps unanswerable question is that when we start plunging into issues of ethics, ethical theories, and ethical practice, in my judgment, there are at least 6 major categories or subcategories of questions that we have to address in the course of doing our ethics. So what I have on the board here is an initial list of 6 broad categories of questions that when we start thinking about ethics philosophically, we need an answer to, and hopefully we need to have answers to all of these questions that are systematically integrated. Now in this unit we're not going to have time to address all of these questions of ethics. Instead we're going to focus on a subset of 1 or possibly 2 of them, but for general framing I do want to introduce and talk through a little bit what kinds of ethical theoretical questions are relevant to answering in a practical way and theoretically consistent way the question of the meaning of life. So first question, the ultimate rubber meets the road question that we want to answer is what should our values be, what kind of virtues should we be? And here the distinction is between a value, that which is worth pursuing, right, in one's life, a goal to set and to achieve, and virtues, we're focusing here on character traits, and the relationship between values and virtues is if we think there's something worth pursuing, say we think friendship is a value that is worth pursuing, it adds meaning to one's life, then the follow-up character question would be, well, what kind of person do I need to be? What kind of character traits do I have to have genuine friendships? And in terms of the people I'm considering as friendship candidates, what kinds of character traits are going to be attractive to me and the kinds of traits that are going to enable that person to be the kind of person who can be a genuine friend here. Now, questions of value theory and virtue theory are in their own right very complicated. There are any number of value candidates that different ethical systems will put forth, and even ethical systems that will agree on a particular value as being an important value. The weighting that's assigned to that value might be very different in a different value system. So, for example, we might say that wealth is a valuable item, right? Or we might say health is something that's valuable and worth pursuing. Or we might say, right, friendship is something valuable, right, and worth pursuing. Now, these can be controversial. We know with respect to wealth, for example, there are many people who argue that wealth is a good thing. It's a valuable, useful tool to enable us to achieve certain of our life goals. On the other end of the spectrum, we know there are people who argue that money is the root of all evil, and so that one should not make monetary pursuits a part of one's life or not. With respect to friendship, for example, there are people who believe friendships can be intensely rewarding and a significant part of a meaningful life. We know also that there are a number of people who are very cynical, right, about social relationships. They do not believe that friendship really exists, that really friendship overtures are, say, a cover for some hidden agenda a person always wants, or that friendships are fair weather, and most people will stab you in the back if they think it is to their advantage or not. So, is wealth really a value? Is friendship really a value? Is health really a value? And we can add to the list here of potential value candidates. To bring in virtues for a little bit here, suppose we say, all right, friendship is a value here. What kind of characters or what kind of people are capable of having genuine friendships? And then we might say, well, one such thing is people who are honest, right? If we're going to have friendships, we have to be honest with each other so we can share various intimate and important details about our lives. Relationships that are based on dishonesty don't have the trust that is possible, and so a friendship is at best going to be shallow in that kind of a relationship here as well. Now then we'll use the question of honesty here then as a segue for talking about various other sorts of issues here. I've got number 3 on my list here, questions of whether ethical goods or ethical principles, statements of various kinds of goods and virtues, are universal or relative. So if we use honesty as a working example, one of the immediate questions that will come up in the case of honesty is suppose we say honesty is good, under what circumstances or when is honesty good? Is it the case, for example, that honesty is always good and that, say, for example, one should always tell the truth? And so one kind of an answer that's possible here is to say yes, and this would be a universalist position. Honesty or truth-telling is something that should always be practiced under any circumstances without any sort of exception. If we believe that approach, then we are universalists with respect to honesty. By contrast, we know, of course, that lots of people who will argue a more relativist or sometimes a situationalist ethic with respect to, say, honesty, and we'll say whether honesty is a good idea, whether telling the truth is a good idea, depends, right, on the circumstances. In some cases, telling the truth is a good idea. In other cases, telling the truth is not a good idea. In some cases, white lies are justified. In other cases, white lies become black lies and inappropriate, and so forth. So, questions of whether moral principles and moral values are universal or whether they are relative. That's a controversial set of issues within ethics as well. Next on the list here, question number 4 here, I have a question of teleology or deontology. Those are philosophy technical terms for whether we think things are good because they yield consequences or they yield results that we take to be good. This goes back to a Greek word, telos, which is the word for end, right, or some kind of a final state. And so we evaluate the goodness of principles or the goodness of actions or character traits in terms of the results that they will yield if acted upon and embodied. So do we think that, say, for example, honesty and whether we should be honest in any circumstance should be judged by the results? If I act honestly in this case, there are going to be these results. If I don't act honestly in this case, there are going to be these results. And I then make a judgment call whether these results or these results are better. In fact, I'm looking toward the future consequences and judging the goodness of the proposed action, honesty in this case, in light of those future consequences. The deontology position, by contrast, is going to argue that ethical principles, ethical goodness is not a matter of consequences, but rather a matter of obligations or duties that are binding upon us irrespective of consequences or the results of acting on the basis of certain principles. So if we take honesty and truth-telling as our example here, a deontologist is going to say something like the following, that we do not assess the consequences of telling the truth or not telling the truth in any particular circumstance. Rather, telling the truth or being honest is a matter of a duty, an obligation that is binding irrespective, right, of the consequences. And in most cases, deontologists will single out cases where we would say telling the truth we know will lead to consequences that are not desirable for us. We do not want to yield those consequences, and so we're tempted to tell a lie. The deontologist will argue completely irrespective of those consequences. The goodness or the badness, the rightness or the wrongness of telling the truth is inherently built into the action itself, and so it's an obligatory action independent of any results that may happen. Now, next I want to use the issue rather of honesty to go back to this issue of egoism, predation, or content, or altruism. If we have a set of values or a set of virtues that we think are good, admirable, right, or important, there's a question of for whom these are and should be valuable or important, or if we think that certain principles are good because of the results they're going to lead to, the question is who the beneficiary of those results should be. So, for example, I might say that honesty is a policy that I'm going to practice. Suppose I am in business. I want to make a profit, and so as a result of that, I want to have customers who are with me long term. And so I say honesty is going to be my best policy as a businessman because that is going to lead my customers to have a certain loyalty to me because they know that I will be a square dealer. And then on the basis of that, they will continue to trade with me and I will continue to profit and flourish in my business. So there I am making a judgment that honesty is good because it's in my long-term self-interest in order to be honest. If I, by contrast, am an advocate of a more predatory ethic, an ethic that argues that I advance in the world at the expense of you, or you, by contrast, will advance in the world at the expense of me, my question of whether I'm honest or not is going to be more tactical. I'm going to make the judgment if I think I can get ahead, that if I can make an advance, right, of some sort or gain at the expense of you by being dishonest, then I will go ahead and be dishonest because that's my benefit is your loss in that particular case. And so honesty is not going to be a good thing for me to do in that case. Instead, dishonesty is the right sort of thing for me to do. So what I'm then doing is evaluating the honesty issue in terms of a predatory approach that sees the world in a zero-sum sort of terms. Or we might, if we are altruistic, altruists argue that ethics is a matter of primarily judging actions' rightness or wrongness, goodness or badness in terms of the effects on other people, not so much upon yourself or even at the sacrifice of one's own interests. And so I might say, for example, I have an obligation in a certain situation to lie because if I tell a lie, say a white lie, it will protect my friend's feelings. And so even though I may not like the idea of having to tell a lie to my friends, for the sake of my friend, I'm going to tell a white lie to insulate them from certain damages. So, do I tell a truth or tell a lie based on my long-term self-interest that I think is going to be win-win with respect to you? Am I willing to lie if I think, lie to you and to harm you resultingly if I think that will benefit me? Or do I judge the rightness or wrongness of lying in terms of its effect on other people? What is my primary standard? Who is the beneficiary of the action in this case? All right, next I want to make a judgment here about some epistemological issues in ethics, jumping down here to number 6. Questions of number 6 are very closely related to questions number 5. How do we answer questions of ethics? All of these rationales and justifications that we've just gone through in talking about these first 4 sets of issues here. In each case, when I was working them through, I was using reason. I was either these consequences or not, or we take this principle and we apply it in this particular way. Is that the right way for individuals to think about ethical issues in their lives? That we should make a rational judgment right about the situation, and that we can make rational judgments about value issues? Or is it the case that when it comes to value issues, ethics issues, and so not, reason is not a fundamental trait? We do not fundamentally get ethics off the ground by appeals to reason or rationality. Rather, in, say, religious traditions, ethics is a matter of faith. One accepts on faith a body of traditions from a religious source. Or in social versions of ethics, that the way we acquire our ethics is through social training, that we're born into a certain culture that has pre-existingly various ethical traditions, and the new person who's born into it accepts those ethical principles and mores, usually without question, or by the time they do come to question, they already are operating within that system. Or might we say that really ethics and value issues are matters of emotions or various sorts of feelings, and we find out what's good or bad for us by reference to what the strongest passions that we have, or what goals or ambitions resonate right with us most strongly in some internalistic method, and on the basis of that we decide what the right thing is to do in any situation, or in the long term what goals we're going to commit ourselves to. Now, I've got 6 questions on the board here. We've gone through them very quickly. By way of summarizing, maybe add a tag that will be a useful summarizing tag here. Question 1, think of in terms of the following interrogative. What we're asking in this case is an answer to the question of what is in fact good, right? What are the values that I should embody in my life? What character virtues should I embody and train in my own self? We're answering here a what question. Question number 2, the question of egoism, predation, or altruism. Here we're asking for an answer to a different interrogative. This is a question of who. Who should be the beneficiary of the values, right, that are in question here? Should it be that I achieve my own values? I should be the ultimate beneficiary in my life. Should I be the beneficiary at your expense, rather, or should you be the beneficiary perhaps at my expense? But who is the question here? Number 3, the issue of universality and relativity of values. Here, the interrogative is the question of when. Right? When or under what circumstances? Is it the case that at all times the ethical principles, the ethical values hold no matter what the circumstance? Or is it the case that different ethical principles and different ethical values come into play under different circumstances and at different times? So here we're asking the question of when. When we're raising questions of teleology or deontology, we're asking the question about the proper moral motivation. And so here the interrogative is the question of why. Why should I do a certain thing? Is it because it will yield various results or consequences that I judge to be good, or should I do it because it's the right thing to do, I have a duty or an obligation to do, and the reason why I am doing it is for that kind of a commitment. Jumping down to number 6 here, this is the question, an epistemological question about ethical issues. How do we validate them? How do we come to know them? How do we decide what is right here? So the interrogative is, right, the how question. And number 5, which is kind of a metaphysics of ethics question that we can bring in at this point here, where ultimately do we go looking for the answer, right, to the question of where ethical values are to be found? Is it the case that ethics and morality is primarily a naturalistic enterprise? It's for us to achieve the good or to live the right kind of life in this world, so that is to say naturalistically, I want to achieve happiness in my life, or we want to have a certain kind of society that is flourishing, both of which are naturalistic bases for ethics, or is it the case that ethics is supernaturalistic in its origin, that it's a matter of God having decided what's right and what's wrong, and God communicates that to us from God's place in the universe, and then we simply accept those principles and apply them as best we can in this particular world. But that their primary source and ultimate scope and application is to be found not in the natural world, but rather in the supernatural world. And that is the question of where. Right? Where do we find the ultimate source and justification for ethical values and principles? All right, 6 questions. For the rest of this unit, since we can't talk about all of these, this would be a semester's course at least in its own right. I'm going to focus primarily on this question here, the question of egoism, predation, or altruism. We will make glancing reference to some of the other questions in sorting through this set of issues as everything is interconnected here. But the heart and soul of our discussion henceforth will be on question number 2. Again, one of the themes in this course is that everything in philosophy is controversial. The issues lead to complexities and different takes in their own right that cause controversies over what the right answers are, and ethical issues are no exception. But part of the reason why ethical issues are as controversial as they are is historical. And in an earlier unit in this course, I made mention of the fact that our civilization, what we call modern Western civilization, although many of the values and institutions of modern Western civilization are now global values, but nonetheless Western civilization is a unique civilization in not being a monoculture. Most of the other cultures and great civilizations historically have been what I'm calling a monoculture. That is to say, philosophically, they are, all of the members of that culture are more or less on the same page on the big philosophical issues about what the right religion is, what the right family structure issues are, what the right politics and economic issues are, and so forth. This is not true of modern Western civilization, and the reason for that is that it is a hybrid civilization. It harkens back to 2 earlier civilizations that had very different philosophical approaches, different answers to the major questions of the universe, life, and our place in the universe. And here I'm referring back to Greco-Roman civilization and the Judeo-Christian tradition. The influence of the Greco-Roman civilizations on our way of life in the modern world is, of course, incalculable. And the same can be said of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Both of those civilizations had power in their own right, influencing many generations and many millions of people. And what we have done self-consciously in the early part of the modern world is to try to integrate the values from those 2 different civilizations. but because they are two very different traditions and have in many cases contradictory answers to the important philosophical questions. It's not a happy marriage. Most people argue that it should necessarily end in a divorce. Others are still hopeful that various kinds of things can be patched up along the way. But one of the places where those conflicts are most noted certainly is in ethical traditions. The ethical traditions that come out of the Greek and Roman tradition are much more naturalistic, much more pursuit of happiness based. The ethical traditions that come out of the Judeo-Christian tradition are much more deontological, much more emphasizing sacrifice and renunciation. And those two broadly different approaches lead to many, many differences on all of the follow-up ethical questions that one can possibly imagine. What I want to do is to make this historical point, just do an imaginary thought experiment based on a survey to get a sense for the ethical temperament of our culture. Suppose we went to, since we're in the United States here, we just rounded up 1,000 ordinary Americans. Say we went to the shopping mall and we just asked the first 1,000 Americans that we came across the following question. Do you think that the values embodied in the Declaration of Independence, the founding document of the United States of America, that those values are good values? And of course, after a moment's reflection, scratching their heads to make sure that they can figure out what those those core values are. There are 3 of them. They will say yes, of course. That's and perhaps they will just say yes reflexively, totally, without even thinking about the value here. But let's pause for a moment and identify what those 3 core values are. Declaration of Independence is a founding political doctrine. We're starting a new country, the colonials then said, in transition to no longer being colonials. And there are certain principles that we take to be self-evidently foundational and important. And on this country is going to be based on the basis of these 3 principles. So all of the things that we do governmentally and culturally, we will be with reference to these 3 principles. Those principles are that all individuals have equal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, if we ask what these 3 principles mean, well, the right to life being the foundational one here, the argument is that every citizen has his or her own life. My life is mine, your life is yours. I don't exist for your sake, by contrast to feudal times where ultimately everybody lives by permission of the king. You don't have a right to your life, you have a right to your life if the king chooses to continue to let you live, but the king can, or one's noble lord can, if he so chooses at any point, use your life to whatever end he so chooses, including killing one if necessary. So the Americans are rejecting that feudal institution and individualizing life as being an inherent value that each individual has that is not to be taken away. Principle of liberty, the right to liberty, every individual has the right to do with their life what they so choose, so long as they are respecting the equal right of all other individuals to live their lives as they so choose. I'm not in any fundamental way a slave of other people, a servant of other people, and nor are you in any fundamental way a slave or a servant of me. And finally, pursuit of happiness, every American's birthright, right? And the Americans did think of this as a universal, so every human being's birthright is that to achieve a measure of self-realization, flourishing happiness in his or her life. And it's up to you as an individual to, of course, to define what your flourishing life is going to consist in, and then you have the freedom to live your life as you see fit to bring that realization into existence. Okay, now that's a little bit of political philosophy here, but these are ethical values, and the argument is that the United States is fundamentally a moral nation because it's taking certain moral values seriously and instantiating them in a political context. Now, if we ask where these political values came from, of course, when we start doing our research on the Founding Fathers, they were political revolutionaries, they were political activists, they were also principled intellectuals, right, on all of these issues as well, but they were not political, philosophical originators in the theoretical sense, and they were drawing on certain traditions. And they were certainly drawing on the British political traditions, most famously associated with John Locke, whom we'll be encountering a little bit later in this semester. Less famously, Algernon Sidney and a number of other thinkers in that tradition. But then if we ask Locke and Sidney and the others, where did they get their principles from? We are then led back to Roman authors, Aristotle, Cicero, and various other ones, both of whom and many others of whom were familiar to both Locke and Sidney, and then also in the 1700s to the American revolutionaries. So Aristotle, of course, is a Greek, Cicero was a Roman, so what we have here is a set of political principles that are ultimately coming out of the Greco-Roman cultural tradition. Right? This is one example of the great influence across many centuries of those two classical civilizations. All right, that's issue number one. Change color here just for fun and contrast. We'll go with some red. All right, carry on this mock survey. Suppose those same 1,000 Americans that we had asked the question, do you think rather the Declaration of Independence, its values are good values or not? Suppose we found some way to contact them again sometime down the road, and we asked them the following question. Do you think that nuns are morally good individuals? Nuns, monks, we might expand to include priests and so forth. Now, whether the person is religious or not, whether the person knows any nuns personally or not, chances are good, if we ask that question of 1,000 standard Americans at the shopping mall, the vast majority of them will more or less reflexively say, yes, of course, a nun is a morally good person. A monk, right, is a morally good person. Now, I said it could be a reflexive answer, but it could also be a thoughtful answer, and behind that reflex is going to be the idea that people who are monks and nuns and priests dedicate themselves to a certain life calling, a religious calling, and central to that life calling is a moral code, which priests, monks, and nuns dedicate themselves more than the average person to trying to live by and uphold and model and teach to other people. If we then ask, in the case of a person who becomes a priest, in most of the Western traditions, right, or a monk, right, or a nun, what is at the center of the moral code to which they are dedicating their lives? Again, there are three principles that come to the fore there, particularly in the Catholic tradition, which is the longest of the Christian traditions in existence. When one becomes a priest in that tradition, or a monk or a nun in that tradition, one undergoes a ceremony where one is marrying God or marrying the church, and that ceremony embodies three vows, which are then to be the organizing principles of the rest of one's life. The three vows that a priest will take are a vow of poverty, a vow of obedience, and a vow of chastity or celibacy. Right. Now, the idea here then is that if one is going to be the morally best person, right, one can be, to strive for the ideal, right, according to this moral tradition, necessary is a commitment to and a principled living by the principle of poverty, the principle of obedience, and the principle of chastity. Now, the principle of poverty then is to say, and this is a stand-in for any sort of attachment to material goods or the money that can be used in exchange for various sorts of material goods. Wealth is not seen, right, as a value. Wealth is an attachment to the physical world, and priests, monks, and nuns, by their commitment, are detaching themselves significantly from the material world. And one symbol of their detachment from things of the physical world is an embrace of poverty, right, as a value. They are detaching themselves from their own will, right, rather than seeing their lives as theirs to live, with their own goals, their own pursuits, right, and so forth. They are to live their lives in accordance with orders from a superior force, the most superior force in this case being God, or God's stand-in, the church. And so one sees oneself as an obedient servant of a will that is more significant and important than one's own. So one gives up one's own self-will to a significant extent. Chastity, of course, focuses on sexual pleasures and romantic attachments, and the idea here again is, since these are profoundly personal pleasures, sexual pleasures and romantic attractions, in order to be the best kind of priest, monk, or nun, one gives up sexual pleasure. And of course, if one is pursuing sexuality or pursuing romance in one's life, that's an enormously time-consuming enterprise. And the argument here is by giving those things up and sacrificing them, one can better serve and a more important calling, which is service to God or service to the church or other people here. But what's built into all of these is renunciation, sacrifice, giving up, and in giving up things that can bring a large measure of personal fulfillment and satisfaction, right, to one's life in this world. All of these values are importantly coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And again, like the Greco-Roman tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition has been enormously influential, incalculably influential on Western civilization, particularly in the modern world. Okay, now the point I am making by contrasting these two, or putting both of them on the board in contrast to each other, is the earlier point about our living in a hybrid civilization. That is to say, we don't live in a monoculture. And in our hybrid civilization, we are trying to embody two philosophical approaches, and in this case, two ethical approaches that are in fundamental tension, if not outright contradiction, to each other. So if we say, for example, from the American Declaration of Independence perspective, or what that means to the American tradition, the good life, right, as defined in an American tradition, is certainly going to include a significant amount of material wealth, so that one can live in a nice house, send one's kids to good schools, have first-rate medical care, vacations in warm places in the winter, and vacations to beautiful places in the summer, and so forth. So the American dream has built into its conception of the good life a significant amount of material wealth. Now that is in direct contrast, right, to a conception of the good life that says the opposite, that the good life, right, as defined, is one defined by the absence of wealth, and it's only to the extent that one has no wealth and takes no interest in material wealth that one can said to be living the good life in a moral sense here. Going down to the second item on the list here, clearly there's a contrast, if not an outright contradiction, between a position that argues that liberty, the power and capacity to make one's own choices, to choose one's own values and course in life, and a mutual respect for other people's doing the same. Nobody's being fundamentally a servant or slave of other people, and right at the other end of the spectrum, a moral code that places obedience to others or an other as a significant core value. So should one see oneself as obedient, servant of other people, or do you see yourself and all others as autonomous, free individuals? Major moral contract there. And then, of course, in the third one, there's a big difference between an approach to one's life if one makes one's happiness one's birthright and dedicates one's efforts to achieving happiness in one's life. For most people, a major component of happiness is romantic and sexual, to find someone with whom one can have a long-standing happy relationship involving romance, eroticism, and sexuality, and if not one person, a series of significant relationships in one's life in which one achieves sexual and romantic happiness. That, as a conception of the good life, certainly is in direct contrast to a conception of the good life that says no sexual pleasure should be a part of that approach to life, that one is moral to the extent that one forswears and abandons any interest in sexuality, romance, or eroticism. Now, the point of the contrast here then is partly to make that historical point. We do, in many cases in the contemporary United States and in many places in the Western world, admire both priests, monks, and nuns and the Declaration of Independence, which is then to say that we're admiring two moral codes that involve very different values. And then when we turn to all kinds of applied issues, necessarily we're going to run into various sorts of conflicts, debates over what the core values should be, and in some cases people will be applying values that are coming out of a Greco-Roman tradition to a particular situation, and many other people will be applying values that are coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the debate goes on. So now I want to turn to what was question 2 on the board earlier, the debate between egoism, predation, and altruism as the answer to the question about what the standard of value should be, or who the primary beneficiaries of the values, whatever we take the good values in life to be. Now I want to start with, again, the question of the meaning of life, and suppose we address that question journalistically initially, just to get some initial working data here. Suppose we say, if we were to ask what a meaningful life consists of, right, or if we could put that question negatively, what are the things such that if you didn't have them and you had no realistic prospect ever of having those things, life would not be worth living? And then we start just to generate a standard conception of what the best kind of life possibly would be, and what would some of the ingredients on that list be. Well, there are a lot of things that immediately then start coming to mind. Suppose we say, for example, that health is then an important value. We might say what we're doing right now is important. Education, right, is an important value. Having a career is something that's valuable. These are all, so far, 3 things that people do invest significant amount of time, money, and effort into. Oh, and then, of course, just mentioned money, right, is an important value. We might say friendship, right, is an important value. We might say that art is an important value. Just using art broadly here, how much music is important to us, or watching movies or reading works of literature is a value to us. We might have leisure, right, as a category here, in which we might travel or engage in sporting activities and so forth. All right, so we start to then just generate, right, a brainstormed list here of value candidates, things that we think might be important values. And that's an open-ended list. At any point, of course, we can always add more things to the list, or subtract them if we no longer come to think of them as important to our lives. But I want to move on then to a follow-up question here. Suppose we have a list of things that we agree, or if I'm doing this individually, that I think are important things worth incorporating into my life, part of an overall good life. For any of them, we can ask why it's a good thing, right, or not. And that will then lead us not to simply have just a brainstormed and unstructured kind of list, but to give a rationale for the inclusion of any particular value on the list. So, draw a line here. Suppose, for example, we pick this one, which is the one that we're engaged in right now. Suppose I say, all right, education is a value. Why is it a value? I say, well, for most people who are engaging in the educational process, they're going to school, they're going to college, they're investing a certain amount of money and time in that. It's because it will pay off in terms of a career. Right? So what we've done here is connected one item on our list to another item on the list. Or it might be the case that the person is pursuing education not for career reasons, just because they enjoy the process of learning and they have a certain amount of leisure time. So what they're doing is pursuing education because they want to get certain leisure values. And with the leisure value, say, well, why do they do that? Well, there might just be a certain amount of pleasure, intellectual pleasure, that comes from learning things that one didn't know before. Okay. Let's take this one here. So then we say career is a value, and education is a value because we think it's going to pay off in terms of a career. Suppose we then do the same thing for career. Why is a career a value? And then there are a couple of things that are important to say here. One is our career pays the bills, right? We get money from our career, and importantly, we're motivated by getting the money that's going to be included in our paycheck, and that's a big part of the rationale there. So we have education connected to career, which is connected to money, so we have a cause and effect list with a couple of connections being made here. I think it's also important to say that people pursue their careers for usually more than monetary reasons, particularly people who are investing in education. For any given amount of money that one can earn, there are any number of careers that could yield that amount of money. For most of us individually, the number of careers within that category that we're actually interested in doing is a much smaller subset. So if we say, for example, $50,000 a year is a nice amount of money to earn currently in the United States, that's above the national average. So suppose you said, all right, a career will earn me $50,000 a year, but there still are lots and lots of careers at which one could earn $50,000 a year. Why do you choose this particular career as the vehicle through which you're going to earn that particular value? And then we start to think about other values that our careers give us. For some people, working outside or working inside is important. For some people, having certain skills and being able to exercise those skills is very important, and they gain a great deal of satisfaction for doing so. For some people, working with other people socially is an important value. For some people, not having to work with other people socially is an important value. Now, all of these other, in many cases, non-tangible things that our careers do us, a sense of not having to do the same thing over and over again, or the ability to craft one's own hours and flexibility and so on. All of those things the economists call psychic income. And this is something that we don't quite have on the list yet, so I'm just going to add it in here. So we will pursue a career for various psychic values, as well as for various material values, including the money that we can get from it. Okay, carrying on. Suppose we say, all right, take money. Why is money a value? If we have money, then we can buy various things that we take to be necessities, like food, shelter, clothing, and so forth. And those things are good because they lead to health. If we don't have those things, our health deteriorates. So education leads to career, which leads to money, which leads to health. We also will spend money on our friends. If we have families, we'll spend lots of money on our families. Those are always very expensive operations. And then we can ask follow-up questions here. In the case of friends and family, why are we spending all of that money on our kids and people we care about? Well, in some cases, we are doing it because with our friends and families, we will be engaging in various sorts of leisure activities again. But also we hope to get love from our families, and we do love them, and so we see them as an outlet or object of our love. And so we have love, which is not on this list here, but we can add it here as well. We will also spend money on all sorts of leisure activities that we don't do with our friends and families, listening to music independently, reading books independently, going for walks or exercising independently. So there's a whole category of leisure activities here. Some of those leisure activities we might do for the sake of our health, like engaging in sports, or it might be that we want certain kinds of challenges. Say we enjoy competitive challenges or the exercise of certain kinds of skills, or it might be the case that we are interested in certain experiences of beauty, right, or various kinds of sublime experiences, experiencing the majesty of nature, right, or the beauty of certain kinds of artwork, and so on. This is very simplified, but it does make a point about values. The idea is that we take values as thinking human beings and nest them in cause and effect relations, that I'm pursuing this for the sake of that, which I'm pursuing for the sake of something else. And ultimately, it all adds up to my life, that I want to have a certain kind of life that I will take to be a meaningful life. And that's the question I want to turn to next. Suppose we take this as a serious exercise as individuals, and we work out our flowchart, right, so to speak. And then we step back from our flowchart and ask about the following situations. Suppose I have a life in which I am successful in my education, and perhaps I'm continuing my education in my spare time. I'm still engaged in a process of lifelong learning, and I am enjoying various pursuits there. My education has paid off. I've gotten a career that I am satisfied. It's the kind of work that I enjoy doing, and I enjoy the material rewards that I get from it. The money that I get also means that I am able to support myself with the various necessities, and so my health as a result is in good shape. I've worked on my friends and family relationships, and I've got friendships that I'm satisfied with and enjoying. I'm happy with my family, and I love them and feel loved by them. And I have an array of other leisure activities, sporting activities, artistic pursuits, traveling the world pursuits, and so on that I'm enjoying. So the whole package is going well, right? What do we call that kind of life, where the person has put together a package, worked at it, and achieved their major life goals, and is continuing to work on those things successfully? That is a life, if we put it all together, that is a life, right, of happiness, right? Or to put it in more Aristotelian language, we could say that is a life that is a flourishing life, right? The person is living the kind of life, the best kind of life that we think of a healthy, successful human being as living. All right, theoretical point number one will be that one of the major positions in ethical theory says that this is the right way to think about ethical values, and I'm going to call this principle right now ethical theory number one. I'll put it up on the board here, ethical principle one, and we'll assign a label to it a little bit later. And it says something like the following: the primary goal in life is for individuals to achieve happiness. Okay, and we'll put a box around that one. All right. This life is a very big, complicated, multifaceted, long-term project, and the way we talk about life in its entirety, its ultimate goal is that the best kind of life is the happy life, right, or the flourishing life, and so we capture it in a principle like this. So we have built in here a few semi-technical concepts here. One is this notion of a primary goal. That is to say, it's a goal by reference to which we measure all other things. So if in this case here we say happiness or flourishing is the goal, when we're thinking about all of the other things, as we do at various points in our life, we are thinking of them in terms of their impact on our primary goal, which is happiness. So for example, perhaps I'm in a career that I'm not very happy with, I'm middle-aged, and I'm considering whether I should change careers, and if I do, I probably would need to re-educate myself to get another skill set, to launch another career. How I will make that decision is by reference to, will a career shift, all things considered, make me happier or lead to a more flourishing life than I have currently? If my answer is yes, then I will do so. If my answer is no, then I won't. If I have tried various leisure pursuits and I'm enjoying them, but another possible leisure pursuit comes along, then I will decide to take that one on or not and explore it by judgment, again, of the same sort of a judgment rather. Will this contribute to my long-term happiness, right, or not? I may have been friends for someone with a long term, and we're very close friends, but we've drifted apart. Is this a relationship that I should continue to invest in, or is it the case that the friendship really is not going to progress? It's only going to deteriorate because we're on very different life paths. Is this person someone I want to remain friends with or not? And again, the question is, will this contribute to my long-term happiness, right, or not? That's the concept of a primary goal, using it as a standard by which to measure and evaluate all subordinate goals. The notion here, we've emphasized individuals, right? The idea here is that valuing is fundamentally individualistic. And that correlated concept is that this is my life, if I'm thinking this through, or if you're thinking it through with your own flow chart, it's your life, and so I'm thinking about my education, I'm thinking about my career, I'm thinking about my financial issues, my friends, my families, right, and so forth, all in the context of my being the person who is the recipient, right, or the consumer of all of these values, and you would be doing the same thing as well. There's a notion here of achievement, which I can underline here, that none of these things just happens. All of these important things are not things that in fact can just be given to you or handed to you on a silver platter. They are all things that have to be achieved by self-responsible commitment, perseverance, right, and so forth. Education is something that I have to do. It has to be a personal accomplishment. You can tell me lots of stuff, but I have to think it through for myself and absorb it intellectually myself. A successful career is something that I have to do, right, for myself. Making my family relationships work is something that I have to do. It can't just be given to me. Nobody can just come along and give you a hobby or an avocation that's going to be fulfilling. It has to be something that I choose or you choose, right, for yourself, right, and so on. The consumption of the various necessities is, and the creation of those necessities for consumption is something that a self-responsible person will achieve, and so forth. So the idea here is that happiness on this conception is not just something that happens arbitrarily to individuals, but rather it's something that individuals find themselves in through a process of commitment, effort, and achievement here. Now, in philosophy speak, the principle here will say we're thinking of individuals as ends in themselves. And the achievement point is to pick up the point that individuals are responsible for achieving their ends. Right? So it's my life, and also my life is responsible. Okay, put it all together, right, then we have the concept, right, of life. All right, and I want to give this ethical principle a name. It's one of the major traditions in history of Western thought. And the name that it most commonly goes by, so I'll erase the ethical principle here, is the principle of egoism. That is to say it's an ism, which is a principled abstraction. And then the stem in this case is the ego, the Greek word for the I. And so it's a theory that places the individual ego, or the individual self, or the individual life at the center of ethics, and argues that maximizing that individual's life, self-realization, happiness, flourishing is the most important thing in life. So we have a position that will then say core values, right, are then going to be a person's career, their various social relationships, their friendships, their families, their health, their wealth, and various sorts of leisure activities, including art and travel, etc. Those are going to be core values that one strives to achieve, and hopefully in a coordinated, mutually successful kind of way. On the other side, built into this approach to ethics are our core subsidiary principles, the idea of seeing those individuals as an end in oneself, that your life is yours to live, my life is mine to live. I'm not a means primarily to your ends, nor vice versa. The notion of being self-responsible, that the achievement of my life goals is my responsibility primarily. The achievement of your life goals is primarily yours. Of course, we can help each other out, hopefully in a mutually beneficial way, but nonetheless the primary responsibility for each individual's life resides with that individual. And then finally, I would add a concept, or just reiterating a concept that we have here, an achievement focus, right? That you have to commit yourself, you have to be persevering, that you have to have an investment focus in your life. I think the good results are the things that are going to occur only to the extent that one is committed to achievement and all that that entails. Education. What if we are educators and we are thinking about education in an egoistic way? How will we think about the ethics component of our curriculum, our methodology, the way we relate to students in helping the students achieve what it is that they're going to achieve in their lives? What in addition to the epistemological issues and the issues about human nature and the issues about metaphysics, all of which have implications for education, what will the value component of our educational system be, or how will we approach all of those issues here? So I want to propose an educational mission statement based on an egoistic approach here, supposing that we are subscribing to this approach here. To the extent that values education is an important part of our curriculum here, we will think of it in the following way. We will say the purpose of values education is to empower students with the knowledge they need, the skills that they need, and the character they need for them to achieve a happy life. Let's unpack this a little bit here. The notion is that the students arrive in the education system with certain capacities, and obviously have some of those capacities developed to some extent, but they are not adults yet, and so their capacities are not fully developed. They're not fully adults and able to achieve their lives independently. So what we want to do then is empower them. That is to say, make them more powerful, bring their capacities online and fully developed in a way so that they are as powerful and competent and capable as they possibly can be. And then we have three dimensions of empowerment that are important here. Knowledge, right, is going to be important. For example, if we say career is one of an important life value that we're designing our educational curriculum with an eye to, one important bit of knowledge is going to be for students to understand the range of careers that are possible to them, so that they can find the one that is most likely to be a fit for them. Or if we want them to have an enjoyable leisure life, to experience lots of great art, to travel the world, knowledge that's going to be necessary for them, certainly all the mechanical skills about reading and interpreting art and so forth, but just an awareness of what the world is like, what all of the interesting places are like, so they again can choose which ones they might be interested in exploring. Or to give them a full knowledge of the range of music that is out there, so that while of course they're experimenting and sampling on their own, nonetheless they're likely experimenting and sampling from more than a fairly limited range of the music that is all out there, so exposing them to the full range of musical possibilities as part of the knowledge that we want them to have. Then skills, right? Skills are operationalizing the knowledge so the person is in a position actually to act right on that. If we say, for example, that social living, friendships and families are enormously valuable and enriching, well, in many cases that's a very complicated thing to bring off, and there are lots of delicate and diplomatic situations that arise, and a certain skill set is going to be enormously valuable if a person is going to be able to partake in and navigate and enjoy all the things that social living can require. And then the third element here is character. Character are dispositional traits to act and behave and think in certain ways. We want the students to develop a certain kind of character so that they're not torn with internal conflicts, so that in all of these activities they are more easily able to figure out what they need to do, how to go about it, and to call forth their resources in a way that they enjoy those pursuits and are effective at doing so. And then the idea is that we want them as individuals to be achieving it, but achievement of a happy life is a big, long-term and complicated process. So having empowered them with the knowledge, skills, and character, we'll put them in a position then to be able to, by the time they leave their schooling, set off on that project and achieve great things in their lives. Okay. Everything in ethics is controversial, including all of this that's on the board so far. So now what I want to do is turn to Another way of thinking about ethics fundamentally that says everything here is wrong, that if we're going to put ethics on a proper foundation and think our way through it, we need to start at a very different place and we're going to reach very different conclusions. I want to introduce two other approaches to ethics by means of a story, a fairly famous story that comes down to us in many versions called The Myth of Gyges, G-Y-G-E-S, Gyges. It's a story that we learn from Herodotus, one of the early Greek historians, and also there's a version of it that appears in Plato's Republic, where Plato makes a great deal of it and puts great weight on it in talking about the foundations of ethics. Now, a standard version of the story is to say that Gyges was a shepherd, a young man, no prospects, no family prospects, and he had a job which was basically to take the sheep from a village in the spring up into the hills and mountains, hang out with the sheep all summer while they grazed, and then at the end of the season when things got cold to bring the sheep back down to the village where they would be housed for the winter, and essentially he would then be unemployed for the winter. So he had a low-paying, low-status job, and clearly he smelled like a sheep all of the time. So legend has it that one summer Gyges is up in the hills with the sheep, has a lot of times on his hands, so he's poking around in some rocks and he discovers a ring. And it seems to be a very expensive, well-made gold ring, and in the middle of the top part of it, it has a huge stone. And so Gyges is playing around with it and he puts it on his finger and turns it to the inward position, at which point he becomes invisible. Naturally, he's surprised by this, turns it back to the outward position, and he becomes visible again. So what Gyges now has then is a ring that enables him to become invisible at any point that he wants. Now, here's the question. What happens next in the story? Now, whether you've heard the story or not, chances are good you can make some very educated guesses about the next developments in the plot, right, so to speak. So, Gyges has a magic ring that enables him to become invisible at any point. What happens next? And I will use red for symbolic purposes here. Okay, we have Gyges. We'll put him here. Gyges finds a ring, so we'll add a ring. And we do philosophy math. Ring plus Gyges equals, well, Gyges, first thing with the ring is buy sheep, leaves them, heads back to town where the action is, and as the story happens, he then immediately starts to steal a bunch of stuff. Whatever he wants to steal, with a little bit of thought, planning, preparation, and the ring, he can get it. He's also a young man, and what else do young men want, particularly young men who have no status and have not been very successful in this particular area? He wants sex, but the easiest kind of sex to achieve with any woman he wants, again, if he's moderately careful, is rape. And so a series of rapes ensue as the story goes. And then, as the story also carries on, a certain number of people end up dead. And it's a big mystery how they are killed, so forth. So here's the situation. Gyges add a ring, and we get these kinds of actions here. Now, this is a myth, which means it's probably not true, particularly the ring part. There may or may not have been a real historical Gyges, who's the basis of the story here. But more importantly, it's an allegory. And so the question is, how do we interpret the allegory here? And the idea that Plato especially wants us to draw from this is that if we want to do serious thinking at the foundations of ethics, before we start deciding what people should and shouldn't do, we have to have a very clear assessment of what the raw material is that we're working with. What is the human being whom we are expecting to be the ethical agent, and what kinds of prescriptions are going to be appropriate for him. Now, Gyges then, in this case, is a stand-in for anybody, right? The idea is that he is a representative of human nature. Right? And the idea then is that anybody in Gyges' position, having the ring that he had, would do variations on the same sorts of things that Gyges did here. The ring is metaphorical for power. Where with the ring, the invisibility, Gyges now has the power to get away with things that he otherwise would not have been able to get away with had he not had the ring. And then all of these things here, murder, crime, murder, stealing, raping, and so forth, those are all crimes, right? That's the word that I'm going for. And that is to say, the definition of most crimes is actions that involve some forcible component that are win for the perpetrator, right, or a gain for the person who is engaging in them, but a loss, right, to someone who is the victim, right, of the crime. So in this case here, stealing, Gyges gains something, somebody else loses, right? Or in the case of rape, Gyges gets sexual satisfaction, but somebody else suffers pain, humiliation, and so forth. In the case of murder, Gyges gets revenge, but somebody clearly loses their life, so it's another win-lose kind of transaction here. Human nature plus power leads to crime or antisocial behavior or behavior that benefits some people in society, right, at the expense of other people, putting it in that abstract formulation here. So what is the moral of the story then? Well, one moral of the story might be to say that this is true. This is a true account of human nature. Power added to human nature does yield these results, and the reason why is that human nature is constituted by certain, right, desires. For example, in the case of stealing, right, we didn't find it surprising that Gyges steals because people are, by nature, people that are driven by greed, right? We have a strong desire for stuff that's built into the human condition. That Gyges would rape is not particularly surprising. The argument runs because human beings, again, by nature, are born with certain powerful desires. We have built into the human condition lust, and we want to satisfy our lust. The fact that some people would end up dead if we had the power to kill them is not particularly surprising from this perspective, because when people anger us or cross us or otherwise get on our bad side, we naturally want to kill them and take revenge on them. So a desire for revenge is also built into the human condition. All right, so human nature is constituted by these foundational desires. Given the power, we will act to satisfy our desires, even at the expense of other people, and that's what we're dealing with. Okay, moral of the story then is the following. I'll put this down here, calling it ethics principle number 2. The primary goal in life is to get the power necessary to satisfy one's desires at other people's expense. All right, perhaps not what you were expecting, right? But this is one of the major operative ethical principles in history of humanity, people operating exactly according to this here. The idea is that Gyges is the human condition. We're not going to change human nature. There is power out there. The only question is going to be who gets the power, and given human nature, some people are going to win, some people are going to lose. So you might as well be the one who wins, or I might as well be the one who commits myself to winning, and to recognize that we're locked in a zero-sum conflict, and that's the human condition that we're not going to change, and so the question is only going to be the distribution of the winners and the losers. In some versions of the story, Gyges doesn't stop with murder, rape, and stealing in the area that he was initially born in. He climbs his way up to the top, ends up killing the king of the whole area, marrying the queen, and then he's living the best possible kind of life. And the appeal of this approach for those who think that this is the right kind of approach is to say, isn't it the case that being the absolute dictator, that is to say, to have the unlimited power that a dictator has, is the best kind of life? Because if you have that power, right, then you've got all the riches disposable or at your disposal. You can have any woman that you want. You can marry the most beautiful woman. You don't even have to be faithful to her. You can have your harem if you're a male and that's what you want. Anybody who angers you or bothers you, you can have them killed or gotten rid of. And everybody has to do what you tell them to do because you're the one who has the power. Anything you desire, you can achieve in your lifetime. Isn't that the best kind of life? And the myth of Gyges then is seen as a rationale for this kind of a principle. And we can make an analogy to the animal kingdom, anthropomorphizing this principle to other animal species that act according to the same way. Suppose we are a lion, a male lion, and what's our implicit ethical principle when we're acting as a lion? Well, the lion, if you're a philosopher for a lion, would say that he is locked in a zero-sum struggle with the various other animal species that are his prey. He has no problem with eating them. Their loss is his gain. And the issue is being the most powerful and strong lion that he can so that he can satisfy his desires for eating and aggression right at any point that he feels he wants to. Same thing holds within the species of lions. The male lions are locked in zero-sum competition with each other for access to the females and for dominance over the pride as a whole. So the idea here for the best thing for a lion then is the idea being to have the power necessary to subdue all of the other male lions so that one can have sex with the females at any point that one wants. And one is not compassionate for the other female, or the other males rather, not saying, oh, those poor males over there, they don't have any sex. I'm the one who's having all of the sex in the pride. Oh, those poor zebras who are going to be my lunch tomorrow. No, that's completely an irrelevant consideration. In fact, that would be an immoral consideration for the lion. The lion is a predator, and so he should take pride in being a predator and cultivate the predatory traits and the power necessary to satisfy his predatory instincts and needs. Okay, so now for ethical principle number 2, I'm going to assign a label to this one here as the analogies to the animal kingdom, taking lions for examples as our analogous species here. This is an ethic of predation. The idea being that human beings, like the other animal species, are predators. In some cases, especially the male of the species is seen as a chief predator. And so human beings, as part of the animal kingdom, are subject to the same laws, including ethical laws, that the rest of the animal kingdom is subject to, and we should make no bones about that. And what we then need to do as educators is cultivate in the next generation the kinds of skills and traits that are going to enable people to succeed in a zero-sum world of predatory conflict. All right, now coming out of the myth of Gyges, though, is another ethical tradition, but reacts against that the myth, seeking the myth as a cautionary tale or as a statement about human nature that ethics has to fight against for the achievement of certain other values. The predatory ethic takes the myth of Gyges as a true statement of the human condition, but embraces it and doesn't then see a conflict between ethical values and human nature. So erase this part here just to make a little bit of room here. I will put a box around predation, and I will switch colors to blue just to draw out some different implications and to contrast a third position with the predatory ethic here as well. All right, so suppose we take this to be a true picture of human nature, add power, we're necessarily going to get zero-sum social interactions, or what we can call crimes. But rather than, as the predatory ethic is satisfied with that, or makes no bones about it and makes its peace with it, so to speak, we take that to be a bad thing. And so we make our first value judgment here, which is to say that crime is bad. Because if we have criminal behavior or antisocial behavior of this sort prevalent in society, then what happens is that society, right, breaks down. We cannot have social living, commerce, friendship, family relationships, of the best kind if we don't have social structure, and crime undercuts social structure, so therefore crime is a bad thing. So then the question is going to be, if we want to have society but crime is an obstacle to it, then in some way we need to stop crime. That pushes us back here. If crime is a result of two factors, the availability of power combined with human nature, then one of these two things has to be addressed. Now, chances are very good that we're going to say we're not going to be able to change human nature. This is a constant. People are constituted by greed, lust, revenge, and various other desires. So the thing that we have to focus on then is this issue of the distribution of power. So if we then say, as a result, society's breaking down is bad, and that is led to by human nature. It's going to be the combination of human nature and power that is the bad thing that then has to be addressed. So what we're then going to have to say is that the more important thing, or that it is more important to have society than for individuals to be able to satisfy their desires whenever they want. That if there's a conflict between the satisfaction of desires and the needs of society, then it's the satisfaction of desires that has to give way. Then the satisfaction of individual desires. And this way of analyzing the situation then is going to be to say that we have a conflict then between what's good for the individual and what's good for society. And the question is going to be, how can we then, when necessary, stop or restrain the satisfaction of individual desires rather enough so that we can get the kind of social harmony that we need. Now there are two broad approaches that are possible here. One is a political approach. We can say that what we will then have to do is have various sorts of external restraints. We might have a very strong police power, for example, in which a great deal of power is concentrated, and so that the power that the government has in its police force is much more powerful than any individual has, and so as a result, people will fear, right, the police, and it will be the fear of the police that will restrain them from using whatever power they still have available to them, and so that they won't act in a criminal way, right, as much as possible. Now, we're not going to focus on political issues in this course. Instead, we're focusing on ethical issues. What we want is for people internally to restrain themselves so that they don't act on human desires, and teach a certain ethical code that people will hopefully internalize. And if they do that, internalize it to the extent that they do internalize it, they will restrain their own desires and not act on them, and then social living here will be possible. Now, what we then need are internal checks or internalizations of certain ethical prohibitions that will cause people voluntarily to regulate their behavior. And to specify the kinds of ethical prohibitions or internalizable checks that we want, the ones that are going to work here are going to be ones that attack, in this case, the ones that are the desires that are the most dangerous, the most likely to be antisocial ones. So, for example, if we take greed, we say, all right, sure, people are greedy by nature. We're not going to change that fact about them. But what we can do in our ethics education is right from day one, as soon as we see various sorts of greedy behaviors and greedy desires manifesting themselves, we will take that as an opportunity for a moral lesson to teach the child something about wealth, acquisitiveness, money, property right, and so forth. So if we think, for example, of religious traditions, many religious traditions that have a very similar view of human nature will start saying things like, it will be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. So the idea here then is a rich person is not very likely then to get into heaven, because being a rich person involves certain kinds of immoralities. And to the extent that the child believes that, or comes to believe that, he or she then is less likely to pursue a life path that involves acquiring riches. Or we might say something like, the love of money is the root of all evil. To the extent that a student believes that the love of money is the root of all evil, it's not going to change the fact that he is attracted by money, but he's going to have this belief that loving money is problematic, and he's then more likely to restrain his acquisitive desire to a certain extent. So what we'll have in this case here is certain ethical prohibitions, and the person will experience guilt to the extent that he thinks about those prohibitions and they come in conflict with the natural human desires that manifest themselves, as they will manifest fairly regularly through life. But the idea is that the guilt that the person feels inside at a desire that he takes to be a bad desire will serve as a modifier internally on his behavior. We can do the same thing with revenge. The desire for revenge is going to be natural, but what we can then do when students get into conflict or children get into conflict and start taking matters into their own hands, dealing with the situations, is teach them that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. The idea being that taking vengeance or revenge or trying to deal with justice yourself is not something that you should do, that is the province of some other authority. Or we can teach students who are harmed, damaged by someone else, who are feeling strong desires for revenge to turn the other cheek. The idea being that instead of being harmed, taking matters into one's own hand and acting in a self-defense way to stop further harms, to take a defensive position and to try to deal with it through a pacifistic approach. Or we can say that forgiveness is a primary virtue, and that whenever anybody harms you, again, you should not seek revenge of any sort. Instead, one should forgive the person who has harmed you. Now, the purpose of all such formulations is the idea of controlling the natural desire for revenge by juxtaposing against it a commandment, a moral commandment, or a set of moral beliefs that are in direct conflict with it. This will, of course, set up an internal conflict within the individual and a certain amount of guilt, as there's a conflict between what he wants to do and what he thinks he should be doing. But again, hopefully his belief will prevail to a certain extent and moderate the behavior that's an undesirable behavior. So we have prohibitions based on guilt as internalized moral checks, and our moral code then should emphasize strongly prohibitions. The problem we have is people doing too many things that we think are bad things. We want to have an ethics that is focused on controlling or restraining or stopping the kind of self-interested behavior as described here from manifesting itself, so that society can to some extent flourish. Now, the point of all of these things is that to the extent one acts on the basis of them, all of these things do involve a certain amount of renunciation. Right? If I'm going to be a good person according to this moral code, I have to not act on my greed, not act on my lust, not act on my desire for revenge. All of these things involve a certain amount of sacrifice, on my part. Supposing I have the power, as Gyges has, to the extent that I could satisfy all of my desires at the expense of other people, I have to give up the satisfaction of those desires. To the extent that I give up all of those things, there's a certain amount of suffering, that is going to ensue to the individual. I really, really want to satisfy my lust, but I don't satisfy my lust. There are psycho and physiological consequences that are painful if one does not act on the basis of that. Or going without something that one really wants, or giving up a strongly felt desire for revenge. All of that involves, at least in a transitional time, a certain amount of suffering. But the point of all of this is that if the individual engages in the renunciation, the sacrifice, and the suffering, while he does not benefit directly from that behavior, other people benefit from that behavior. That is to say, they don't suffer the consequences, and social living can go on, and that is judged to be the more important value. So what we have here is ethical principle number 3. I'm just going to write the formulation down, and then I'll assign a label here, which is to say the primary goal in life is for individuals to sacrifice for the sake of others in society. Now, this is a primary ethical goal here. What we're then saying is the most important thing is the maintenance and fostering and flourishing of society. Since we think individual human nature, what makes an individual flourish and what makes an individual qua individual happy and satisfied is in conflict with the needs of society, then the first ethical imperative is going to be one of sacrifice. The individual has to sacrifice to the extent that is necessary for the sake of others in society. And so then we have the individual being sacrificed, right, for the sake of others in society. That label, we can give the traditional label here of altruism. Again, it's an ism. In this case, it's alter from the Latin alter, which is other, so it's a principled otherism. And this ethic says the most important thing then is for individuals to put other people first, and whatever is necessary on their part to sacrifice and suffer to enable the flourishing of the other, that's what we then have to do. So one other label I want to add here, or one other concept that's important here, is a concept of selflessness. And we'll take that literally. The individual has to internalize the idea that the self is of less importance than the needs of society. And when there is a conflict then between something that's of greater importance and something that's of lesser importance, it's the thing that's of lesser importance that has to suffer and sacrifice or renounce for the sake of the thing that is of greater importance. Okay, what this then is going to mean for education is that we're going to the extent we are ethical educators as altruists, put the social to the fore and be on the lookout and vigilant for cases where what the individual wants and is in conflict with what is social, and start as early as we possibly can teaching individuals the virtues of renunciation and sacrifice and putting the needs of others before their own. And to the extent that we then teach those values and get kids habituated to them, we're then putting them in a position to grow up as individuals who will be the right kind of individuals that are fit for social living being the most important value that we're striving to attain rather in our philosophical system. I want to formalize everything we've said so far and put it in a structure that I think captures the material very concisely in a condensed fashion, and allows us then to make comparisons more easily. I've got the three positions that we've looked at: ethical principle of egoism, ethical principle of predation, ethical principle of altruism. Not yet judging which one is true and which of the other two is false, but just using them as categories describing the principles behind various sorts of ethical behavior that are out there, or internally to various modes of thinking and behaving in the world that humans will engage in, what the ethical rationale for that mode of behavior and thinking would be. And along the left column here, I've got three dimensions. I think each of these needs to be characterized in three dimensions. One is, as human beings, our actions, if they're to be morally evaluated actions, they're actions that we choose, and we choose to engage in them because we have a reason or a motivation right at work. So what we can ask is, what's the intent right behind the action that a person engages in? We're also interested in the existential consequences of our actions. We behave or we act in the world, and there are certain results. And there are two then morally relevant dimensions here. What are the effect of one's actions on oneself? So we can ask what the consequences of of the actions to oneself are. And then to the extent that other people are involved or one's actions affects them, we can ask what is the effect of one's actions on those other people. And then we can then define the three positions in terms of how differently they fill in the cells along those three dimensions. Now, the idea behind egoism is the idea that one is an end in oneself. One's life is one's own, and so one is striving to achieve a flourishing life or the happiest life that one can possibly live. And so one's intent is a self-interested intent. Now, built into egoism is a content notion about what one's interests are, right? That one's interests are best served by achieving one's health, achieving a career in which one can be productively creative, being self-responsible and self-supporting then becomes a value, having loving family relationships, enjoying beauty and artistic experiences, and so on. But the idea then is that if one's intent is governed by pursuit of those interests, then one is functioning in an egoistic fashion. That one should then engage in actions that do satisfy, right, one's interests, that is to say, engage in actions that benefit oneself, right? Go to college to get one's degree, have a career that pays you the kind of money, right, that you want, and so forth. And then built into egoism is the idea that self-interest properly defined and pursued by the individual will have the effect on other individuals, either of leaving them neutral. If, for example, I am in my study at the end of a day, sipping a glass of wine and listening to some music, I'm acting in my self-interest, increasing my state of flourishing in the world. I'm engaging in action that is very beneficial to me, but nobody else is affected by that action, so they are left neutral. Or I engage in actions that have a beneficial effect on other people. So, for example, if I go into business, for example, as a career, if someone is voluntarily paying me money, well, I'm acting on my self-interest, trying to advance my career and my other life goals, and I am getting the paycheck from the person who is paying me, so that is to my benefit. But presumably, there's a voluntary trade. I am providing some value to the other person that they value more than the paycheck they're paying me, so that person is benefiting as well. Or if I have a friendship with someone, I will, say, go out on a weekend evening with that person. I enjoy that person's company, so I benefit and my self-interest is thereby served. But if the person is a genuine friend of mine, then presumably my spending time with them is also a great benefit to them, and so that person is benefiting as well. And the idea of egoism then is that moral actions and the right kinds of actions for the individuals involved, and to the extent that we are social, mutually beneficial to all of the individuals involved, are actions that are described in these three dimensions by those concepts there. Now we know that the predatory approach to ethics thinks very differently, right, about the values. It does think in terms of self-interest as the appropriate kind of intent, right, that one should seek, right, one's own interests. Under most predatory ethics, though, interests are defined rather differently there. Interests are defined in terms of the satisfaction of desires, such as the greed desire, the lust desire, the desire for revenge, and so on, captured in the myth of Gyges, as we have seen. So one should then, of course, act in a way that satisfies one's interests. So the consequences to oneself of the various actions that one intentionally undergoes should be beneficial, but the predator will argue that the nature of human social relationship is necessarily zero-sum. We are in a conflict-driven world, so necessarily my benefit is going to be matched by your loss. Your benefit will be matched by my loss, or I will intentionally sacrifice you, right, if necessary, to achieve the benefit that I want. And so the predatory ethic will argue that the best kind of actions, or the actions that systematically pursued are going to achieve the best kind of life, are going to be actions that involve these three dimensions coming into existence at the same time. Now, by contrast, then, the altruists juxtapose themselves to both the egoistic approach and the predatory approach, and what they argue is the root problem is this notion of self-interest that is common to the egoist and the predatory approach, and the notion that one should be striving to benefit oneself. So instead, if we're going to achieve the socially desirable behaviors, what we need to teach people is not to put their self-interest first, rather to see themselves as of less moral significance, of less importance, and so to be guided by the motivation or an intent of selflessness, to engage in actions that have as an effect to, or a consequence rather, on other people, a social benefit. The most important concern is the effect of one's actions on others. Are they contributing to the social welfare or removing a potential loss, right, to the social welfare? And given the altruistic approach, the thing that is necessary to individuals is that they be willing to sacrifice, or that they have to suffer a loss, right, of some sort. And so the best kind of person, or the morally ideal kind of person, is going to be someone who is systematically devoted to selfless sacrifice, right, for the benefit of others. All right, so what we then have is a nice matrix here that arrays the three different approaches. Each is distinct, and it puts us in a position to contrast them, the dimensions along which they're similar and the dimensions along which they differ. Clearly, the egoists and the predators agree on what the guiding intent would be, although they would define self-interest differently in both categories. Both agree that one should act to achieve one's benefit, but they disagree on the nature of achieving one's self-interest in terms of its effect on other people. The predatory approach argues for a zero-sum approach, whereas the egoist approach argues for a win-win approach, or mutually beneficial approach. We can say that the altruist and the predatory approach, they both agree on, actually down here, on this principle here, that we do live in a world of zero-sum, or a conflict world, that moral transactions, or necessarily human social transactions that have a moral component to it, involve someone benefiting at someone's expense. But then that points up the immediate difference. The altruists and the advocates of the predatory ethic want to assign the benefits and losses differently. The predatory approach advocating a self-interested approach, while the altruists are selfless. The predators are putting the individual self above the social, and the altruists are doing the exact opposite. All right, that's an abstract characterization. I'd like to think in terms next of more concrete instantiations of this. One way of, particularly when we are talking to younger people about abstract principles, is to teach morals in terms of role models. And so what we do is we have the students read stories or read journalistic pieces or historical accounts of people who exemplify what we take to be the right kind of moral behavior. So we might choose George Washington as an example of honesty, right, in action, or we might find someone to be an exemplar of integrity, or whatever the value that we want to have the students learn. So let's try to think of people who might be in the position, realistically, of role models that students might likely have heard of, so we can point out examples of them. Or even from an adult context, just think of actual people, right, historically, who would be exemplars of these approaches, so that we can concretize them in our own minds. So take, for example, egoism. Here the phenomenon I want to focus on is the fact of young people who are interested in sports and who will idolize various sports heroes. So for many years, for example, throughout the 1990s and on into the early 2000s, Michael Jordan was the #1 sports hero around the world, particularly among young people. What was it about Michael Jordan, even kids who didn't know him personally, that made him such an attractive figure? What is Michael Jordan's life embodying? And so we would say something like the following. Well, clearly Michael Jordan pursued the career that he did because he loves the game of basketball. It's a thing that gives him great fulfillment. He worked very hard at practicing his basketball skills and talents, and developed that in combination with his natural talents until he was an extraordinary basketball player. As a result of that, he was able to achieve all sorts of life goals. He won various championships. He earned lots of money. He got lots of respect, even adulation from various sorts of people. So he has received enormous values in all kinds of categories that make people happy and have a sense that their lives are flourishing. And what was the effect of Michael Jordan's pursuing his dream, working so hard, and achieving the success that he did on other people in society more broadly? And here we would say it was enormously beneficial. Obviously, the teams that he was playing against regularly, they lost certain games, and so they suffered losses, but that was in the context of a competitive rather structure from which they were all benefiting. But clearly the great benefit, or the great result of Michael Jordan's behavior is a mass benefit. Those of us who enjoy watching basketball played at its highest level got great pleasure from watching Michael Jordan play. His teammates and the owners of the team reaped very great values as a result of Michael Jordan's doing what he did. Advertisers who were willingly paying him millions of dollars to promote their products saw him as an asset, as a value to use to promote their products in a way that was beneficial to them. So what we have then in Michael Jordan's approach is someone who is acting in his best self-interest, who has achieved great benefits in his life, and the result of his doing so is a great deal of benefit to various other people. And people, of course, who are just not interested in basketball, they are left neutral. So I would put Michael Jordan here as an exemplar. and say that part of the appeal of Michael Jordan as a role model, as a hero, is a kind of moral, right, appeal, that he stands for a certain approach to living one's life, a value approach to one's life that is enormously admirable to the extent that one is an egoist. If we think of a more adult example, many people in the business world will admire someone like Bill Gates. And we can tell a similar sort of story here. Bill Gates, as a young man, loved the world of computers and poured himself heart and soul and brain, very powerful brain, into the world of computers. Developed his skills in that area, made some very good business decisions, again, worked hard for a number of years doing something that he loved. So he was pursuing his self-interest as he defined it. He reaped, again, all sorts of benefits as a result of doing so. A great deal of money, pride in building up Microsoft as the kind of organization, right, that it was. And then the net effect on other people is beneficial. Millions, if not billions, of people around the world use Microsoft products to their advantage. They pay a certain amount of money, and the net value of what they're able to do with those software products is a benefit, a net benefit rather, to them. So again, Bill Gates seems to be an exemplar of an egoistic, right, approach, and to the extent that he is seen as a role model, people say, yeah, that's what I would like to achieve in my life. That, I think, is what they are focusing on. Now, there are going to be controversies about both of these individuals. Did Bill Gates, in all of his actions, engage in creative productivity and win-win trade? Were some of his activities or some of the things that Microsoft engaged in more predatory? Of course, there are arguments that are going to be engaged in there. We can make the same sort of issues in the case of Michael Jordan. Did Michael Jordan ever foul people in, or break the rules and get away with it? We can argue certainly about all of those things as well. But clearly the center of gravity, right, morally speaking, in the case of Bill Gates is productive achievement and win-win trade, and the same thing can be said of Michael Jordan in the sports world. Now let's do the same thing for a predatory ethic. Here we can think of some historical examples, various people who are admired, even though you or I would likely admire them, but someone like Al Capone I would put forth as an example here, who was a great hero to many people in the organized crime world and the object of sneaking admiration by people outside of the crime world. Many women found Al Capone enormously sexy and attractive merely because he exuded the power and the success at wielding his power according to a predatory ethic. He climbed his way to the top of an organized crime hierarchy involving any number of predators embodying this particular ethical approach. He was the most successful at it, and so for those who are attracted to that kind of an ethical approach, he is then the exemplar and the person who is a role model here. I would cite various political dictators around the world. Unfortunately, there are a large number of them. People who are dictators in the political arena and usually in the economic arena as well operate according to a predatory ethic. They judge that to be the best mode of life, the one that's going to yield the best kind of results. And the ones that are successful are not only often proud of their achievements, but they also serve as role models to other people lower in the hierarchy. They will say, that's who I want to be when I am further along in my career. Or at a more childlike level, if we can think of children, in many cases, say young boys who are on the cusp of puberty, if they've grown up in certain kinds of neighborhoods that are dominated by gangs, if you ask who are their role models, who are instantiating for them the idea of what the best kind of life is going to be. In many cases, it is going to be the young man or the older man who is higher up in a gang hierarchy, who has all of the bling and all of the women and all of the power to achieve whatever it is that he wants in his zone of life. So from the perspective of the young man making his own choices about how he's going to live his life, what values he is going to pursue, that gang leader is going to be someone who is seen as a moral hero, right, to that particular person. And we can do the same thing for altruism as a moral theory. Think of role models, persons who are heroes from that particular perspective. I think the most famous person of the last half century who would fall into this category would be Mother Teresa. I believe she was originally Albanian and became a monk and then worked in the slums of Calcutta. And clearly in that case, she's not thinking about how can I maximize my life values, achieve wealth and sexual pleasure and romance and all of those sorts of things. Instead, she gives all of those things up in order to dedicate herself to benefiting other people, particularly in this case, people who are extremely poor in Calcutta. Notice, of course, some complication here, given that Mother Teresa is religious. We could, of course, make the argument that really she's a long-term egoist, arguing that she believes in life after death and in heaven and hell, and in a religious tradition that says if she acts a certain way in this life, she gets the ultimate reward by going to heaven, in which case it's just a temporary investment or sacrifice that she's making in this life, but ultimately what she really wants is a long-term benefit in heaven, and so in the short term other people will benefit, and so really she's acting in her long-term self-interest. And there's a certain plausibility to that, and that leads us into some great controversies within religious ethics over the proper interpretation of moral motivation within, say, the Christian tradition, although there are variations in the other traditions as well, whether one should be motivated by works or whether one should be motivated deontologically out of a sense of duty, independent of long-term consequences to oneself or so on. I want to set all of that aside for now and just say that the way Mother Teresa works as a role model or as a hero to most people is because she seems to exemplify the altruistic tradition, setting aside trying to figure out what was going on inside her personal head. The external purpose of her as a role model or hero is to exemplify rather the altruistic tradition. And so what we can then do as students, or as teachers rather, of students or as parents of children, and we're trying to uphold certain individuals as admirable, as worthy of respect, and to try to urge our students to emulate, what kind of people are we going to choose here? And we do know that parents the world over choose very different types of individuals as role models for their children. They themselves try to embody very different moral codes and be role models for their parents. And they point to very different individuals, very different moral types, hoping to inspire their children and students in those directions. So do we want to encourage our students to be the next Michael Jordan, the next Bill Gates, the next gang leader or dictator, or the next Mother Teresa? That's the moral choice in concrete that we are making here. All right, I now want to concretize these issues at a slightly different angle by looking at core human activities that many or most people will engage in at some point in their life, and show how, depending on whether one's an egoist, an advocate of the predatory ethic, or an altruist, one's strategic approach to that area in life is going to be very different. Take an obvious one, for example. Suppose we think about the issue of money. And we say, is money of value? If so, how much of a value is it? And to the extent that money is involved in our lives, how should I act with respect to money, and so forth. Now, in this case here, if one is an egoist, right, egoism as a theory will predict a certain attitude and set of behaviors with respect to money. If one is an advocate of the predatory ethic, there will be a different answer. If one is an advocate of the altruist ethic, a different answer again. All right, so let's then ask in a top-down fashion, with respect to money, make my M more attractive here. If one is an egoist, what should I think of money, and how should I approach behaviorally money? And I think what an egoist would say is, well, money is something to one's self-interest. It's a power. To the extent that one has it, one can use it as a tool for getting various other things that are valuable in one's life. And if I'm going to act to get money, I should do so in a way that yields successfully money for me, but either leaves other people neutral or is mutually beneficial to other people. And the concept that best captures that is the idea of earning. If my strategic approach to money is earning money, then I'm acting in my self-interest to get money, but I'm doing so in a way that other people will voluntarily give me money. I've earned my money legitimately, right, so to speak. By contrast, if I'm an advocate of the predatory ethic, my approach to money is going to be different. Again, I will say that money is a good thing. It's a tool that I can use for various other purposes. I should act in such a way that I get that particular benefit, that I end up with some money in my pocket, but the best way to do so is a way that involves other people losing. So a behavior that fits the category here is stealing. And so advocates of a predatory ethic with respect to money will, as a principled strategy, try to steal as much money as they possibly can. If I'm an altruist, my attitude, again, is going to be different. I might make the argument that money is a value, but that value of that money is not something that I should enjoy myself. Instead, to the extent that I have money, I should be willing to sacrifice that money for the benefit of other people. That is then to say, my attitude and behaviors with respect to money will be focused on getting as much money as is under my control into the hands of other people. And so here, my set with respect to money is charity. And so this then allows us to concretize the debate between the egoists, the predators, and the altruists on this particular area of human endeavor. Is the most moral, central approach to the issue of money to commit oneself to earning it, to stealing it, or to giving it away charitably? Change subjects a little bit here. Suppose instead of money, we talk about sports. Just including in this category for now, games. So we play games as a leisure activity, or we play sports professionally, or again as a leisure activity. If I'm an egoist, how do I think about sports? What's my strategy here? If I'm a predator, same question. If I'm an altruist, again, the same question here. Well, if I'm an egoist, I would say sports are valuable, or as they can be enormously valuable, including games. They can bring a great deal of pleasure to my life. There's the thrill of winning, there's the joy of exercising certain sorts of skills, there's the pleasure of competition and the sociability that can go in sports. All of those things can be valued. And the best thing in sports, of course, is to win. So it's to my self-interest to win as often as I possibly can. That's the benefit. The benefits that come from winning, the self-esteem, the fame, monetary rewards, trophies as symbolic rewards, and so forth. But I should enter into competitive games in a way that's mutually beneficial. So the way we do that in competitive games is that there's a certain set of rules, and we all agree that we are going to play by the rules, because what we're interested in is assigning the winning tag to the person who has the best abilities, the best skills within that particular set of activities that we're calling the game. So what I will then want to do is to play hard, but fair. Okay? And the kind of games that I am going to get the benefit from, the joy of winning, are going to be ones that I did win fair and square because I played hard and I was the one who had the best skill set. Now, if by contrast I'm a predator, I will think about sports and games. Of course, I want the win. I want the money that goes with it, or the trophy, or the esteem that comes from other people from their having thought that I won the game. So I do want that particular benefit, but the other person necessarily has to lose, and the best way to ensure that that happens is by surreptitiously avoiding the rules or bypassing the rules, and we call that process cheating. So the predator is someone who will commit himself to winning by any means necessary, including cheating. And predatory behavior in sports is what we call cheating. That's the descriptor in that particular area. Now, if I'm an altruist by contrast, and I'm thinking about sports and games can bring all sorts of pleasures to our lives here, but I'm more likely to say the important thing in this case here is not that I get the thrill of victory, but rather that the other person, right, get the thrill of victory. And so what I'm more likely then to do is throw the game or let the other person win. Right, I will, again, surreptitiously not play my best, enable the other person to defeat me, and as a result of that, the person then gets the satisfaction of thinking that he or she has won, and that is a sacrifice. I could have had that opportunity right for me, but nonetheless, the more important thing from the altruistic perspective is the effect on the other, and so I'll be selflessly giving up in order to achieve that greater value. Suppose we move on to one more category here, sex. And we think through this area here. Again, how will we as egoists approach the issue of sexuality if we are predators or if we are altruists? What will we think about sexuality as a value? How important should it be to ourselves? And what sorts of sexual strategies or sexual conducts or behaviors will we engage in if we think it is a value or disvalue to whatever extent? Now here, I think the easiest one to answer, the most obvious one, is predation. The predatory approach to sex is the practice of rape. The predator or the rapist is interested in the benefit of sexual pleasure or perhaps the benefit of exercising power over another person, but necessarily that involves a loss, right, for the other person as well. I think in the case of egoism, romantic sexual encounters are a clear exemplar here. There for both parties. They're interested in their own sexual pleasure. They're interested in the emotional fulfillment and visibility and other psychological values that can come from sexuality. And they're also interested in the other person's achieving those same sorts of things. It's a mutually beneficial interaction. And so I think the romantic tag is the best tag that's possible there. Now, sex, from an altruistic perspective, another obvious candidate here is somebody who is celibate. That person is someone who has given up entirely all of the pleasures that sexuality can bring to their lives. And most people who are celibate will do so for professional reasons, arguing that that frees up time and mental energy that can be devoted to benefiting other people, right, and so forth. It's, I think, a little more complicated in the case of altruism. I think there are cases where one can engage in sexual behavior on a fairly regular basis and still be altruistic. If we think of traditional family sexual morality, where, for example, a young woman may not want to have children at this particular point in her career, but she lives in a culture or a subculture in which there's great family pressure for her to get married now and to reproduce in order to carry on the family name, or for various sorts of political reasons, then the young woman rather, is expected to give up her preferences, her choices for what she would like to do for her life in the immediate short term, and do what other people have judged is best. And if she voluntarily decides, okay, I should do my duty to procreate under the circumstances because I have these family obligations or these political obligations, I think that is altruistic. So we can call that a kind of duty sex, and that is perhaps less common, at least in the Western world now, than it once was traditionally. I think also fairly common in the Western world, unfortunately, there was another kind of duty sex. We can imagine a stereotypical scenario where you have a couple who have been married for a while, the magic has gone out of their relationship, and let's say one party is no longer particularly interested in having sexual encounters with the other party, but the other party still is interested in having sex, and so they have a conflict of priorities here. But nonetheless, the one party who doesn't particularly want to have sex anymore feels that he or she has an obligation to have sex. They have a commitment to the marriage, and so there are other things that he or she would rather be doing, but nonetheless, some sacrifice of time for the benefit of the other partner in the relationship. That'll happen. I think that also is a kind of duty sex. We could also raise the interesting case of prostitution, and I'll just leave that as a homework assignment or a thought experiment. Where would we put prostitution on this category, assuming that the prostitute is not being coerced by a pimp or is not a sex slave in some sex slavery ring, but has voluntarily entered into the profession? How best would we capture prostitution on this framework? And indeed, does it fit at all? Interesting question there. Okay, that said, I want to draw a line for now. We have three ethical principles. All of them are prevalent in our culture and have been for many centuries. All of them are making very different judgments about what the important values are. All of them predict very different role models, different behaviors in different aspects of our lives. Our job then as educators, to the extent that we're interested in ethical issues, in helping students sort out what their values should be, what life goals they should set for themselves, what kind of character traits they should try to embody, what they should admire in other people, what they should encourage with respect to other people, how they should relate to other people. All of these are ethically deep and important issues for all of us growing up. Our job then as educators is to think through all of these issues and operationalize them in our curriculum so that when the appropriate moments arise and an ethically challenged issue arises either from the student's initiative or because we want to fold it into the curriculum, we know how we're going to operationalize it and make it an operational belief and behavior for the student in his life.